Welcome to the Museum of the Occupation of Latvia. My name is Pēteris Kalniņš. Our museum's mission is to remember what happened to Latvia and its people under the occupation regimes of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union between 1940 and 1991. In this podcast series, we look at the workings of the occupation regimes in light of current historical scholarship. Follow our podcasts online, or better still, come visit our museum here in Riga. The topic of our second podcast is dismantling the autonomy of Latvia during the first Soviet occupation in 1940 and 41. In 1939, the Soviet regime under Stalin took its first steps toward occupying Latvia by demanding and imposing a mutual assistance treaty allowing Soviet armed forces onto Latvian territory. After the June 17, 1940 occupation and the annexation to the USSR, Latvian institutions were transformed or replaced to bring the country under the complete control of Moscow. Yet throughout this process, the Soviets maintained the illusion that Latvia still enjoyed political autonomy. At first, the Soviet occupation regime preserved the outward appearance of the regime of state power and administration established by Kārlis Ulmanis in his coup d'état of May 15, 1934. On the one hand, this maintained the illusion that the independent Republic of Latvia continued to exist. On the other, the authoritarianism personified by Ulmanis served as a cover that let the occupiers avoid even the need to introduce merely formal democratic procedures. On June 19, 1940, Stalin's deputy in Latvia, Andrei Vyshinsky, demanded that President Ulmanis replace his cabinet of ministers with a list of replacements approved by Moscow. The next day, Ulmanis issued a statement on the composition of the new government, creating the impression that the old government had simply been replaced by a new one with essentially the same ministerial titles and powers and with August Kirchensteins as the new prime minister. On June 21st, the Kirchensteins government held its first session with President Ulmanis in attendance. In his address, and by following the procedure for transfer and acceptance of power, Ulmanis legitimized the government dictated by Vyshinsky, naming the replacements as ministers invited by him. It was vital for the occupiers that Ulmanis relinquish power voluntarily, creating the appearance of a legal succession of state power taking place with his blessing. On that day, the new government issued a declaration promising to preserve Latvia's independence. The Kirchensteins government kept intact the authoritarian system of state power and administration in which the cabinet of ministers held both legislative and executive functions. It ran a propaganda campaign claiming that democratization of public administration was taking place, but beneath this facade, it prepared for the abolition of independent state institutions. A decisive step towards the Soviet annexation was taken on July 4, 1940, when the new government proclaimed parliamentary elections for July 14th and 15th, allowing only 9 days for the entire election preparation process. This was illegal, as only the parliament was entitled to call new elections. The election itself was fraudulent, given that only one candidate list of Moscow-approved candidates was even permitted. Parties attempting to print and submit competing lists were banned, and their members were jailed. Before the end of the voting days, Soviet media reported a 97.6% majority voting in favor of the Working People's Bloc. On July 21st, the newly elected People's Parliament, so-called, unanimously adopted a declaration proclaiming Soviet rule in Latvia and establishing the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic. It immediately petitioned for the accession of Latvia to the Soviet Union, requesting that the USSR admit Latvia as a constituent republic on the same terms as the other existing Soviet republics. On August 5th, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR granted this request to admit Latvia into the Soviet Union. This transformed Latvia from a sovereign state into a part of another state and revealed the earlier declaration to have been a lie. The so-called People's Parliament, or People's Saeima, then set up a commission to draft a constitution for the Latvian SSR. Up until its adoption on August 25th, the titles of the institutions and senior officials of what the communists called bourgeois Latvia were largely preserved. Thus, occupied Latvia was governed with a peculiar mixture of the remnants of the Constitution of the Democratic Republic of Latvia, Ulmanis authoritarianism, and Stalinist practices. For example, beginning on July 21st, Kirchensteins held the posts of both president and prime minister of the Latvian SSR, while also remaining acting foreign minister. Since the People's Parliament met for only 3 days and did not create any legislation, all legislative work was carried out by the Cabinet of Ministers of the Latvian SSR, as had been the case under Ulmanis since 1934. Although the annexation of Latvia was made easier by Ulmanis' authoritarian system of power, the main instrument of the Soviet takeover was military force and the threat of its use. From the perspective of international law, aggressive threats, occupation, and annexation were carried out illegally, and so all acts committed in their train could be considered illegal. Therefore, the Republic of Latvia, although having lost its independence, continued to exist de jure. In fact, several Latvian embassies and consulates continued to operate in Western countries, refusing to obey orders from the government of the Latvian SSR. In the ensuing decades of Nazi and Soviet occupation, the Foreign Service of the Republic of Latvia continued to function as the only remaining independent state institution, and that only to a very limited extent. From this point on, the process of Sovietization gradually encompassed all spheres of social life. Beginning in August, the state apparatus of the Latvian SSR took form. All 3 Baltic states' people's parliaments declared themselves to be the new Supreme Soviets, or councils, of the new Soviet republics. Following the fraudulent July elections, no new Supreme Soviet elections were held. The Latvian army was also dismantled by steps. On July 11, 1940, the Soviet Union established the Baltic Military District with its headquarters in Riga. On August 17th, an order was issued to transform the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian armies into territorial corps of the Red Army, their officer corps largely replaced by Red Army officers. Yet even at this stage, the illusion was maintained that Latvian Red Army units would be used only to defend Soviet Latvia from invasion. In July 1940, the Latvian Border Guard Brigade was subordinated to the Latvian Ministry of the Interior, which in August became the People's Commissariat of the Interior of the Latvian SSR. In October 1940, these border guard units on Latvia's eastern border were disbanded. And even after Latvia was joined to the USSR, free crossing of the former Latvia-Soviet border was not allowed. NKVD border guard units continued to guard the former borders of all 3 Baltic states and Latvia's former borders with Estonia and Lithuania up until the outbreak of the war. With the adoption of a new Soviet Latvian constitution, ministries that continued to exist were transformed into people's commissariats or were otherwise renamed on the Soviet model. The state apparatus was purged of Ulmanis supporters, especially those who took part in the May 1934 coup, and all district and town leaders were replaced. This purge continued throughout the first year of the Soviet occupation, culminating in the mass deportations of June 14, 1941. By the eve of the Nazi German invasion, Moscow held all 3 Baltic countries as part of the Soviet fatherland and dispensed with any further need to maintain a facade of local autonomy.